Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty incredible.
Incredible's a good word for it.
Turning seawater, the salty stuff, into the clean, drinkable water we rely on every day.
Right.
Now, you might already know a bit about reverse osmosis, RO, the main event in this whole process.
Yeah.
But today, we're going behind the scenes to explore the unsung heroes, the pre-treatment steps.
The crucial first steps.
Exactly. So, why are these initial steps so crucial? It seems like we're already starting with a pretty vast and natural water source.
Well, you're right. The ocean is vast, but that vastness comes with, let's just say, a lot of extras.
Extras?
Think about it. Seawater isn't exactly SPAD-A ready.
Okay, I can see that.
It's like this. Imagine a high-performance base car that's your reverse osmosis system.
Powerful, efficient.
Exactly. But even the best engine needs clean fuel and a well-maintained system to run smoothly.
Yeah.
Pretreatment is all about prepping that fuel, the seawater, so the RO process can work its magic without, getting gummed up along the way.
Okay, I'm starting to see the challenge here. So we're not just talking about filtering out the occasional seaweed and seashells, are we? What kind of contaminants are we really dealing with in this raw seawater cocktail?
We're talking about a whole spectrum of impurities.
Like what?
Everything from visible debris like sand, seaweed, even tiny sea creatures, to microscopic particles you'd need a microscope to see. And let's not forget dissolved salts and minerals.
Oh, right.
Those invisible troublemakers can really mess things up if they're not dealt with.
Sounds like a real mixed bag of challenges.
It's a bit of an understatement.
So how do we even begin to tackle this complex cleaning process? Where do we start?
It's all about stages. Think of it like a series of increasingly fine sieves.
Right.
They start big and gradually get smaller, targeting different types and sizes of contaminants at each stage.
Interesting.
It's a multi-step filtration process that's actually pretty elegant in its design.
All right, let's break down this filtration dance, step by step. Where do we even begin with something as seemingly chaotic as seawater?
First up, we've got screening.
Screening?
Yeah, picture a giant heavy-duty sieve.
Like something out of Willy Wonka's factory.
Exactly. But instead of separating candy, it's catching all the large debris in the seawater.
Makes sense.
Things like seaweed, shells, plastic. Anything bigger than a grain of rice isn't getting past this initial checkpoint.
That's going to make a pretty big difference right off the bat.
It really does. This step alone dramatically changes things.
That's quite a visual. I can almost hear those screens rattling as they catch all that ocean debris. So we've tackled the big stuff, but something tells me that's just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Oh, absolutely.
What comes next in our quest for purified water?
You're right. Removing those obvious contaminants is just the first act. Now, we're dealing with smaller suspended particles, the kind that make the water cloudy.
I see.
And this is where things get a bit more, chemical.
Chemical.
But trust me, it's quite fascinating. We're entering the realm of coagulation and flocculation.
Coagulation and flocculation.
Yeah.
All right, you're going to have to break those down for me. Those sound a bit more like terms you'd hear in a chemistry lab than a water treatment plant.
You're not wrong. They are chemical processes.
Okay.
But they're remarkably effective at tackling those smaller, sneakier particles.
Okay, I'm listening. So how do they work?
First, we add a coagulant to the water.
A coagulant? And what is that exactly?
It's something like ferric chloride or aluminum sulfate.
Oh, okay. And what exactly does a coagulant do? Is it like a magic potion that makes those tiny particles disappear?
Not quite magic, but it's pretty close. The coagulant neutralizes the electrical charges that keep those tiny particles floating around, allowing them to clump together.
Interesting.
Think of it like using a magnet to gather iron filings. Suddenly, those individual particles become one big, manageable clump.
So we're basically creating miniature particle parties in the water, encouraging them to all clump together. That's pretty clever.
It's a pretty neat trick.
But how do we actually remove these larger clumps from the water?
That's where flocculation comes in. We gently mix the water, which encourages those tiny clumps to collide and stick together, forming even larger masses called flocks.
Flocks.
And these flocks are much easier to remove because they're big enough to get caught in filters or even float to the surface.
So we've gone from seaweed and seashells to these microscopic particle conga lines.
Mm-hmm.
What's next on our microscopic purification adventure?
Now, get ready for this. We're going to give those unwanted particles a little lift.
So lift, what do you mean?
Literally. The next stage is dissolved air flotation, or DF.
DF. Okay, you've officially lost me.
It's simpler than it sounds. Basically, we inject tiny microscopic air bubbles into the water.
Microscopic.
These bubbles cling to the flocks we created earlier, making them buoyant, like attaching tiny little life rafts to each clump.
So it's like giving those tiny impurities their own personal escape route. I bet they're happier floating up and away rather than being stuck in a pipe.
You could say that. And the best part is they naturally float to the surface.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they're easier to remove.
Exactly. It's kind of like a bubble bath gone wrong, with all the unwanted stuff conveniently gathering at the top.
I have to admit, that's a visual I wasn't expecting. Okay,
Yeah.
So we've screened, we've clumped, we've floated. It feels like we've covered a lot of ground already.
We're getting there.
But I have a feeling we're not quite done yet.
You're right. We've tackled the heavy hitters, but now it's time for a deep clean.
Deep clean. How deep are we talking?
Even with all those larger contaminants removed, there's still a microscopic world lurking in the water.
Oh, I don't doubt that for a second.
Our next step is Multimedia Filtration, or MMF.
Multimedia Filtration. Okay, my inner child is hoping this involves lasers or sound waves or something equally cool.
It might not be as flashy as a laser show, but it's pretty impressive in its own right.
Okay, sell it to me.
Imagine a tank, but not just any tank. This one is filled with layers of different material.
Different materials, like what?
We're talking layers of sand, gravel, and anthracite.
Anthracite.
It's a type of coal, each with different sized granules.
Okay, I'm picturing it. So how does that work?
It's like an obstacle course for those remaining particles.
An obstacle course.
Yeah, as the water flows through this carefully designed labyrinth, it encounters progressively smaller gaps.
Trapping those increasingly tiny particles along the way.
You got it. By the time the water emerges from the MMF, it's crystal clear.
Okay, I'm officially impressed. But something tells me we're not quite at the finish line of this purification marathon, are we? How much smaller can these contaminants possibly get?
You'd be surprised. Even with MMF, some incredibly small particles, things like microscopic bacteria and viruses, can still be hanging around.
Really? We're talking that small.
That's where cartridge filtration comes in.
Cartridge filtration. Okay, that sounds a little less high-tech compared to everything else we've discussed.
Don't underestimate the power of a well-designed cartridge.
Okay.
These are like the superfine filters of the water treatment world. They're often made of materials like pleated paper or ceramic, with incredibly tiny pores that can trap particles as small as 5 microns.
5 microns, what is that, like the size of?
To put that in perspective, that's about 25 times smaller than the width of a human hair.
Wow, okay. Now we're talking seriously small. It's like we've entered a whole new dimension of clean. But I'm curious, if these contaminants are small enough to slip past all the previous stages, are they really that big of a deal?
That's a great question. And the answer is a resounding yes.
Really?
These tiny particles can impact the taste and odor of water, and some, like bacteria and viruses, can pose health risks. So getting rid of them is crucial.
I hadn't thought about that.
Plus, we also need to protect the RO membrane, which is even more sensitive to these tiny particles than our taste buds.
Well, that makes sense. So we've tackled the visible and the microscopic. What's next in this meticulous purification process?
Now we need to address some, let's call them chemical concerns.
Chemical concerns. What do you mean?
We're switching gears from physical filtration to tackling, invisible threats.
Invisible threats, like what?
Pesky microorganisms and mineral scale.
Okay, now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. The invisible forces that can make or break the whole system. So what's first?
First up, we've got to deal with those microscopic party crashers, bacteria and algae.
They still haven't learned their lesson.
They might be invisible to the naked eye, but they can cause big problems in a water treatment system.
Oh, I bet. So how do we deal with those?
Our weapon of choice. Chlorine.
Chlorine. Like what we use in swimming pools. It seems counterintuitive to add something we associate with pool water to something we want to drink.
You bring up a good point.
Don't we want to get rid of that?
We do, but chlorine is incredibly effective at killing bacteria and algae, preventing them from growing in the pipes and tanks of the treatment system.
So it's a necessary evil.
That's one way to put it. And to your point, we don't want it in the final drinking water, so we remove it before it reaches the RO unit.
Okay, I was going to say, we can't exactly skip the chlorine and risk contaminating everything, but how do we get rid of the chlorine so quickly?
We use a process called dechlorination.
Dechlorination.
Often with a chemical called sodium bisulfite.
So it neutralizes the chlorine, making the water safe for the RO membranes, and eventually for us.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. It's like we're playing a strategic game of chemical chess. carefully introducing and removing substances to achieve a very specific outcome. What's next?
Now, we need to address a different kind of threat. Scaling.
Scaling. Is that what I think it is?
It's exactly what you think it is. Like what builds up on the inside of a tea kettle.
Ugh, not a fan. Hard to clean.
Yep.
And I'm assuming it's not good for these systems either.
You got it. Scale buildup can significantly reduce the efficiency of the RO membranes, leading to costly repairs or even replacements.
So how do we fight this mineral buildup? Do we send in tiny little scrub brushes to chip away at the scale?
That might be fun to watch, but thankfully there are more practical solutions.
I was hoping you'd say that.
One common approach is adding something called an antiscalant.
Antiscalant. It's all in the name. What exactly is this wonder chemical, and how does it work?
Antiscalants are a group of chemicals that interfere with the crystallization process of those scale-forming minerals.
So they don't remove the minerals.
Right. They prevent them from sticking together and clinging to the membrane surfaces.
Interesting. So how do they do that?
Imagine trying to build a brick wall with marbles. It just won't work.
I see.
Antiscalants are like making those minerals slippery so they can't latch on and cause problems.
So it's all about disruption. Keeping those minerals on the move so they can't settle down and cause any trouble.
Precisely. Another way to prevent scale is by adjusting the pH of the water.
pH. Okay, we're back to chemistry class again.
Yeah.
Remind me, how does pH play into all of this?
It all comes down to solubility.
Solubility.
By carefully adjusting the pH, usually making it slightly more acidic, we can make the water less hospitable to scale formation.
And how do we do that?
We often use something like sulfuric acid.
So whether it's using an antiscalant or fine-tuning the pH, it's all about outsmarting those minerals and keeping the RO membrane squeaky clean.
Exactly. It's all about making sure the RO process can run smoothly and efficiently.
Producing the highest quality water possible.
You got it. But even with all these steps, we have one more crucial stage before the grand finale of reverse osmosis.
Okay, you've officially piqued my curiosity. After this epic journey through physical and chemical purification, what's the final test our water must pass?
Get ready for it. The grand finale, ultrafiltration, or UF for short.
Ultrafiltration. Okay, that sounds intense.
This is where it all comes together. If this were an action movie, this is where we'd cue the dramatic music.
Okay, I'm ready for the dramatic music. So what is ultrafiltration?
Imagine this. Membranes with pores so tiny.
How tiny?
We're talking 0.01 to 0.1 microns in size.
Okay, my brain needs some help here. Put that into perspective for me. Just how small are we talking?
Okay, picture a single human hair.
Pretty thin.
Now imagine slicing that hair lengthwise into 10,000 strands.
10,000.
One of those strands would be about the size of the pores in an ultrafiltration membrane.
That is unbelievable. I can't even fathom that.
Yeah.
So we're talking about catching things at a level I didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
So what kind of contaminants are we targeting at this scale?
It's like the final security checkpoint before entering, the really pristine world of reverse osmosis.
Makes sense.
We're talking the tiniest bacteria and viruses,
Wow.
remnants of larger molecules that slipped through earlier stages, even things called colloidal particles.
What are those?
They're so small they never settle out of the water on their own.
I see. So they're like the ninjas of the contaminant world.
You could say that.
So ultrafiltration is like sending our water through a microscopic security screening, making sure only the purest water molecules make it to the other side.
Exactly. And the result, water that's so clean, it would make a laboratory scientist jealous.
Now that's saying something. So we've gone from this initial rush of seawater, teeming with all sorts of, life and debris, to this final stage of ultra-pure water, ready to undergo the transformative power of reverse osmosis.
It really puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? I mean, it's easy to take a sip of water for granted, but when you really understand the journey that water has been on, especially if it started as seawater,
It's incredible.
a true testament to human ingenuity,
Absolutely. To take something as complex as seawater and turn it into something so essential to life. So the next time you take a sip of water, remember the unsung heroes, those 9 essential steps that make clean, drinkable water possible.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And if this deep dive into pre-treatment has your gears turning, I encourage you to explore the fascinating world of membrane technology and the future of clean water. Who knows what other amazing discoveries await? Thanks for listening.